Hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts Podcast.
Hello. It's good to have everybody here.
Good. Yes. Yes. Always love having these conversations. So today I'm really excited about our episode that we'll be sharing with y'all. We are going to be having on the show Dr. Roberto Che Espinoza, and we will be talking with them about their experience in high control religion, how that led to becoming disembodied, the process of learning about embodiment and becoming embodied, and just ways that we can do that in our lives. I have known of Dr. Roberto for a few years, actually. This is my first time of having the privilege of talking directly with them. So really excited to share this conversation with everybody.
Yeah, it's so good. I'm so excited because I think as I'm like reflecting on it, I don't want to go too much into it, because I want you to just listen. But I think I'm just continuously struck over and over about the way that Dr. Roberto presents things in such a doable manner as it relates to embodiment, and then how that literally just shifts the world, right? Like through our embodiment and relationship with ourselves and then others. And I'm excited for people to listen. Yeah, it was such a good conversation. Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, before we get started, I just want to offer a disclaimer to our episode. We recognize that some of the topics that we are discussing in any episode may bring up feelings, emotions, or triggers that might require more processing or be too much to handle right now. So please always feel free to skip an entire episode or any part of an episode and come back if and when you're ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and your lived experience. And so you can feel free to take what you need and leave what you don't.
Hey, dropouts. It's Laura here, coming to you for this segment where we normally do prayer requests. It's just me today, but Andrew sends his thoughts and prayers, and he'll be joining us for our interview with Roberto. Normally in the prayer request segment, we have a chance to get a bit snarky with things going on in deconstruction land, pop culture, and other sections of crossover between religion and other happenings in this world. But instead of doing that today, I wanted to take a moment to talk about what's going on in Israel and Palestine. A little disclaimer. This is not meant to be a political discussion, nor do I believe that I fully understand all the details of everything that's happening. I know that I am not the most educated person to talk about this, as this is not my area of expertise, and my knowledge comes from various news sources, podcasts, and learning from people who are far more educated in this area than I am. So to be honest, that's not really the direction that I want to take with this topic. I do feel strong and equipped to say that as we watch what is happening in the Middle East, I am unequivocally pro-life. I know that this term is usually used in the United States to discuss issues around abortion healthcare. However, I have always considered myself pro-life in the sense that I believe that people's lives matter. And while I don't understand the politics and rules of war, I know that there is a general recognition that even in times of war, targeting unarmed and innocent lives is considered a crime against humanity. There are innocent lives on both sides of this war. We know that half the population in the Gaza Strip are children. We know that there are millions of children in Israel as well. We know that in addition to children, there are many other innocent citizens whose lives have been destroyed and impacted by what is going on. And truly, this is devastating and it should not happen. There aren't sides to that. There aren't some lives that matter more than others. Israeli and Palestinian lives both matter, and it grieves me that so many innocent lives have been lost, impacted, and destroyed. I don't believe that this peace is political. I believe that this peace is what should unite us. If you are interested in learning more about what is happening, I would actually like to point you to the resources that Blake Chastain discusses in his most recent episode of the Exvangelical podcast, which is also the one where he and I did an interview. Blake has gathered some resources and discusses them in the introduction of that episode. So please head over there and look at what he's gathered. What I think I'm better equipped to discuss is the intersections of what is happening in the Middle East and how many of us who grew up in fundamentalism and Christian evangelicalism learned as it pertained to the end times, the support of Israel, and Christianity in general. One of the first things that came up for many clients and folks that I interact with on social media is fear and uncertainty. Okay, I want to take a little detour for a moment. In early March of 2020, when there was a lot of unknowns about COVID-19 and what we would need to do as a result, there were a lot of people in post-religious spaces that experienced a lot of fear and uncertainty for additional reasons beyond what the rest of the world was grappling with. For many people, this was the first time they were having to learn how to make choices regarding their life, health, and relationships without the voice of a pastor or religious leader to guide them or tell them what was right. They were learning to, quote unquote, lean on their own understandings after they had been continuously told for decades that they should not. There was, of course, also a lot of messaging that you must just believe harder, pray more, trust God more, and remember that all things work together for good. In that case, people were encouraged towards inaction and simply trusting God that if God wanted them to stay alive, that would happen through no measures of their own. And on top of this, many religious leaders were promoting end times messaging. They believed that this pandemic was a way to usher in the return of Jesus Christ and where true believers would eventually be taken to paradise. In some cases, there was even an excitement and a welcoming, some people even putting themselves in dangerous situations so that they could hasten this outcome. For many of the people I talk with in personal and professional settings, this was a very confusing and scary time. The possibilities of what could happen were endless and unknown. And for many people who are now on the outside of their religious systems, they stood aghast at some of the actions that people took in an effort to try and quicken the return of Christ. They felt like these people were using tragedy, illness, and death as a proof that God was real, watching over them, loved them, and was coming for them. Interestingly, as things have been unfolding in the Middle East, some of the same messaging has come back up, and some of those same fears, confusions, and utter disbelief have also resurfaced. As I've had the opportunity to talk with friends, colleagues, and clients, there are many mixed feelings as they're trying to make sense of what is happening. Of course, what is happening can be really difficult to try and comprehend, but more than that, there's a lot of emotion over how they were taught about the correlation between Israel and the end times. Many people I have talked to recognize the support of Israel from many different religious groups, not as a support for innocent lives, but as a way to support their religious beliefs of the necessity of Israel's power. In many Christian traditions, there are teachings around what needs to happen before Christ can return and take his followers to heaven. For centuries, there have been scholars, theologians, and the common person looking for signs of the return, making predictions, and then more predictions when their first predictions don't come to fruition. Christian traditions often talk about three things needing to happen before the Messiah can return. First, the nation of Israel must be restored. Second, Jerusalem must be a Jewish city. And third, the temple, the center of worship and sacrifice in the ancient Jewish world, which was last destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, must be rebuilt. That first reason is why many Christians are siding with Israel, because they need Israel to be a nation. They need Israel to remain a nation. They need Israel to maintain their independence so the temple can be built and the Messiah can return. It's why, for decades, folks all over the world want to protect Israel and support any measure to do so. Israel remaining Israel means Jesus will return. It's an interesting concept to think about. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately, how nihilistic our efforts can be in order to try and hasten the conclusions of our faith. Many religious people live in hopes that Christ will come in their lifetime. Their efforts of how they interact with others, how they vote, how they view social justice issues, and their value of a variety of different things can stem from their eagerness for Christ to return. Sometimes this overrides things like common humanity, equality, and even justice. The ends justify the means. So if doing XYZ or pushing certain legislation, outlawing certain practices, mandating other practices, silencing some people and amplifying others, destroying groups of people, entire nations, or even the entire world, if these things offer them hope that Jesus will soon come back, then the ends truly do justify the means. I'm struck, though, by the life and character of the Jesus that the Bible talks about, the one who died to save us for our sins. He was a peacemaker and called his followers to be that as well. He was the one to reach out to the poor, lonely, oppressed, downtrodden, and needy. He was counter to what all the religious leaders thought, preached, and how they acted, and encouraged his followers to do the same. Certainly, I am not trying to promote a specific religious stance. Many people have been harmed by others in the name of Jesus. But it's not lost on me that the person that so many people claim to follow and give their lives up for are the same person whose name they are annihilating others under in tiny and small ways on a regular basis. This brings me back to the confusion that so many people are feeling right now, where the people they have listened to the most, the loudest voices in their lives, the people that they were supposed to be able to look to for wisdom and guidance, now encourage vicious attacks, tragedy, and death to, once again, hasten the coming of Christ. They feel confused because it doesn't seem like the Jesus they grew up believing in, or confused because they learned that they were supposed to earnestly try and save the people in their community rather than engaging in measures that would leave those same people all behind. For me, this is why I often say that fundamentalism is a coping mechanism for a dysregulated nervous system. It would be really nice in times like these to have someone who would say what is right and wrong. It would feel way easier on a deep, deep level to be able to pick a side and have a clear path forward regarding how to navigate a situation like this. The binary, dualistic thinking of fundamentalism offers the illusion of safety because it helps us determine what is right and wrong, and then gives us permission to not have to grapple with anything else. As we begin to close this time of prayer, I don't have any pretty bows to tie this all up in. But what I can leave you with is this. You are brave for considering alternative possibilities. You're brave for thinking beyond the binary and for grappling with difficult questions and for not immediately looking to external leadership and authorities to tell you what is right and wrong. It's okay to be scared and confused. It's okay if even some of these old fears and rapture anxieties start to creep back in. In fact, I would say that's perfectly normal. It's times like these that grounding ourselves into the present moment can be helpful and actually allow us the space to make different choices. I wish I could say there is one right answer, but in truth, the situation is far more complex. There are many both ands. There are many non-answers. And maybe, just maybe, you can give yourself space to consider that one simple answer isn't what we should be looking for anyways. In my book that just came out, I talk about holding on loosely to the things that we believe and how we act because of them. This isn't an attempt to be flaky or wishy-washy. Rather, this is an attempt to hold on to things in such a way that we can grow and change based on information, seasons of life, and who we become as a person throughout the remainder of our lives. This means that it's okay if what you think today about what's happening in the Middle East is different than what you thought a few weeks ago. And it's also okay if in a few weeks from now, you think differently again. These differences simply show your growth as a human. Please also know that if your anxiety, confusion, shame, fear, or anything else feel overwhelming and that you need support, there are many practitioners at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, as well as many other therapists, coaches, and supporters who are available to help you navigate this confusing time. You are not alone. And that is, my friends, I think, a good place to say amen.
Today's guest is Dr. Roberto Che Espinoza. Dr. Roberto is passionate about the politics of radical difference and the ways that our collective differences might shed light on how we become a better body together. Roberto Che Espinoza, PhD, has been described in a myriad of ways: a scholar activist, scholar leader, thought leader, teacher, public theologian, ethicist, poet of moral reason, and word artist. Among these ways of describing Dr. Roberto, they are also a visionary thinker who has spent 2 decades working in the borderlands of church, academy, and movements seeking to not only disrupt, but dismantle supremacy culture and help steward the logic of liberation as a non-binary, trans-queer Latinx.
Dr. Roberto is the founder of the Activist Theology Project, a Nashville-based collaborative project that is dedicated to social healing. Dr. Roberto is also on faculty at Duke Divinity School, teaching at the intersections of queer theory and theology ethics. Dr. Roberto was named one of 10 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress in 2018.
As the founder of the Activist Theology Project, Dr. Roberto is committed to the work of social healing through the politicizing of public theology initiatives and writes and creates both academic and other valuable resources, including digital resources.
Dr. Roberto is a non-binary trans man, Latinx, and adult on the autism spectrum who calls Nashville, Tennessee home. They are the author of Activist Theology and Body Becoming, A Path to Our Liberation. Dr. Roberto's next book is a project that focuses on belonging and freedom.
We are honored and excited to have Dr. Roberto on our podcast. So, without further ado, here is our interview with Dr. Roberto Che Espinoza.
All right. Well, welcome, everybody. We are so thrilled today to have Dr. Roberto Che Espinoza. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, that's good.
Awesome. We are so thrilled to have you on the podcast today. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
It's good to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yay. Well, let's just jump right in. And maybe if you want to start off by giving us just maybe a brief overview of your experience, maybe inside religion, experiences of maybe being disembodied or divorcing yourself from your body, kind of as a way to survive inside those high control systems. I know your work spans outside of religion. So wherever you want to go with that, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. And no, it's a great question. I think that I learned very early. So I grew up in Texas. I like to say northern Mexico, the Republic of Texas. I grew up during a time during the rise of the megachurch. And so I grew up Southern Baptist and went to college with people like Matt Chandler. I don't know if you know that name.
I sure do. I actually put a line of his in my upcoming book.
So, saw very close the high control religion. And, so went to Grace Bible Study at Hardin-Simmons University, was very familiar with Greg Mott's work at Texas A&M, Steve Hardin's work. During that time was also figuring myself out as most people do when they're in college. And I also felt called to something greater than myself that was diminished, denied, and relegated to just something in my head. And I think that being surrounded by mostly white men and white women telling me how to live, how to be, and that I must not be hearing God correctly really shaped who I was at the time and who I grew to be as an adult and, eventually as an academic, that I live life from the shoulders up. And I write about this in my latest book, Body Becoming. But, I feel like being Mexican American, being an academic, those were in constant turmoil with one another because I was being socialized in, what is now we refer to as white supremacy, but a very much a disembodied life. I mean, I don't know how to describe it other than my body was not anything that I considered. And so much of that came from being told by people in power that I was mishearing the Holy Spirit. So that's traumatizing. That's dangerous. It's toxic. And when I went to seminary in Chicago and studied with a Latin American Baptist theologian who I still am in contact with, and we talk every day. But I went to study with her, and that's when I began to piece together, being outside of the megachurch system and living in Chicago, and really, literally being a fish out of water in a foreign place like Chicago. It allowed me to reconnect with my cultural roots as a Mexican American. It allowed me to pick up a grammar of embodiment, but it would take me years before I implemented that grammar. Because I was I live in academia, which academia is not the place for embodied living.
Yeah, very shoulders up. I love that. And you say that frequently throughout your book, is that shoulders up. I think that is so poignant, because it is so, that is how you function in high control religions, is, cutting everything else off from the shoulders below. So I think that is really interesting. I'm curious to know, was there any pivotal points when you say you moved to Chicago, and that was it was just a different atmosphere? You were exposed to different ways of living, thinking, being embodied, or maybe even introducing yourself to your body. Was there any pivotal moments that you can think back to that you go, that was really meaningful? That was that grain, right there.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the time that I was in seminary under the tutelage of Dr. Nancy Elizabeth Bedford, but the year-long clinical pastoral education residency. So I did 4 units of CPE as a discernment project on whether I should go on to the PhD. And, being in the hospital with very sick people, man, it all fell apart for me. And really seeing how people had misused religion with vulnerable populations. By then I had gotten some distance from Texas and the megachurch, and that was during the beginning of the emergent church movement. And I just was really suspect of all of it because I had gone to school with people like Matt Chandler, who I saw control people, so, and I really felt during that time called to the vocation of theologian. And then, of course, trying to figure that out as a trans and queer person, where, 20 years ago, it just wasn't the cool thing to do. Now it's like, there's so many conditions for people to come out these days. But 20 years ago, it was still very, even in Chicago, it was still very much not a thing that people do. And but the year that I did the CPE residency as a trauma chaplain is basically when I had the reckoning with my mind and my body. Now, again, it would take years. I mean, it would take years before I came, wisdom, we can grow in knowledge and wisdom, but wisdom really is something on its own, right? But it would take years before I would be able to come to terms with that experience in the hospital, and how everything fell apart for me, just theologically and culturally, and to see the disparity, health disparities, to see the economic disparity, all of these call into question of how do we live an embodied life when there are so many fractures and fragments, so.
Yeah. It's so interesting that it's in the presence of people that we can't be unchanged, or like
I can't unsee it.
Yeah. I know that was really pivotal for me too in my clinical internship as a therapist, going, oh wow, the boxes, they don't exist that I've categorized. I love hearing that, because it's so it's such a beautiful thing that people are the ones, the lived experience is what changes us. That's awesome.
Yeah. So I'm curious, and I'm trying to think how to articulate this question in a succinct way, but you definitely described that being like a reckoning. You described it as, and like how you can't unsee these things, and you can't, it's like when you've seen what you've seen, you can't just go back. It can't. I am curious, where did you go from there? Like, I know it was a year, certainly it's an ongoing lengthy process, but what came next I feel like that's such a therapist question, but I'm so curious.
I mean, I still work with my therapist every week about naming the feelings, right? Like, where do I feel this in my body? And, today I'll answer your question, but I just want to give an example that, like, today I still don't have the language of embodiment, right? I'm still very much in process. But after it all fell apart and after the sort of reckoning of like, oh shit, like, this is not good. I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna pursue the PhD, which may seem counterintuitive because the PhD is not something that fosters embodiment. It is something that is highly traumatizing for marginalized people and disembodied for all of us. But I went on to do the PhD because, again, I felt called to something greater than myself. And I spent a lot of time. I mean, my whole dissertation was on the materiality of the body and how the body is always becoming. And so everything that I've done up until, this point today, I think has been in response to how disenfranchised I was in high control religion. And I try to use ideas and thinking, critical thinking, to bring people along, right? To plant seeds. And so that's really what was next, right? The reckoning is like, okay, now I'm going to go do a PhD. I didn't know what the hell I was getting into, like I know how to do academia. I know how to do it very well, but the transformation during that, I called my PhD my wandering years because it's a time, well, during my CPE experience, I had a really amazing supervisor who is Unitarian Universalist, and that it just broadened the door, right, of entry. But during that year, I embraced agnosticism, and I was like, I just don't know. I don't have the epistemological capacity to know, so I'm just going to lean into the not knowing. And then the 7 years of my PhD was very much interrogating all of this stuff. But what I found is that there was something calling me home, which is part of the reason why I left the Bay Area to move home to the South in Nashville. I wanted something that was familiar. And then, over time, the stories of Jesus, the story of just relationally how we account for those stories, how they get told. It taught me about relationship and embodiment. And, I haven't really returned to church so much as I have returned to the stories of Jesus. Now, I'm in church a lot, preaching, and planting seeds, but I still think that our communities, our faith communities, are still very much stuck in what I call a passive epistemology, where we require people to come and receive, and we don't help them think for themselves.
Yes.
And what I'm very interested in is cultivating a very active epistemology where the space between us is the wisdom, not just what I have to say, not just what you have to say, but the space in between us. And that to me is the spirit. So I've done a lot of reclaiming. I obviously I wrote that book basically as a love letter to my wife, because without her, I don't think I'd be where I am today. Again, relationships, right? Relationships shape us. Relationships teach us. And it was in relationship with critically ill patients at the hospital that taught me that the body is important. And then it's been in relationship with my wife for all these years. I mean, she's a dance academic and a somatic therapist. And, it's just being in conversation with her. Like, I don't think I would have been able to write that book, Body Becoming, without being in a relationship with my wife, So I just want to say, like, to answer your question, what's next is it's relationship, and it's finding the right kinds of relationships that will cultivate the wisdom that we need to reconnect ourselves to ourselves.
That is so beautiful. I think, as I'm hearing you speak, the two themes of like relationships and embodiment seem to come up like as the correlation, like time and time again. I wonder, that seems to be one of your public messages that that you're teaching and preaching about.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can just kind of share about that a little bit, how you see relationships and embodiment going together.
Well, I think that we are not taught how to do relationships well, especially those of us who come out of evangelical traditions. Men are taught to be, to have a toxic masculinity that prioritizes control over every relationship. And women, female-bodied people, their labor is invisibilized and they are taught to be passive. I just think that's bad relationality. I think not only is it transactional, but it's not generative. And so I try to help people move from a transactional relationality to a more generative relationality. And I think being queer and having this queer orientation and moving throughout the world as a trans person has shown me the steps on how to be in relationship with people. I mean, I tell people all the time, it's white men who reach out to me and ask me to help them. And I find that always so fascinating. But I think that I have cobbled together an ethical masculinity that creates conditions for men to be open to change. So I actually do a lot of work with white men, and it's very rewarding. But men and women are disconnected from their bodies as a result of religion, and in particularly high control religion. So I just try to plant seeds.
I love that.
Yeah, no, I love the emphasis on relationship, and I'm not even sure if I have a question here, but I just really recognize how high control religion, but then even in the deconstruction space or even the secular healing space, like therapy, that just this whole space, like it's still very much so often this individualized culture.
Right.
I feel like so individualized and so dominated by white men, even though therapy is a lot of white women are therapists, but still I feel like it's academia anyway is very dominated by white men in this in psychology and counseling, and it's just so individualized. It's like it's still so disembodied, and so people don't know how to be in a healthy relationship. And I'm not saying I have the answers either. I'm still learning that very much.
Sure. I think we're all learning, and when we can own that, our relationships can be better. I'm not an expert. I feel like I live with an expert relationship person. And I'm still learning.
Yeah. And it sounds too, and correct me if I'm wrong, like you're getting at this point too, of like the more embodied you become, the easier it is to translate that into relationships, which then transforms your own internal experience of embodiment, which then kind of this circular kind of pattern that you're developing. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, I write a little bit about this, about kind of a figure eight or the eternity circle, right? That we're always becoming. And when we stay on that path of difference and repetition, I feel like I'm in a lot of conversations which sound very familiar, but there's just enough difference to make them a different conversation. And I think that's what it means to be on the way.
I think one of the things I appreciated, even when I first saw your book here, for those of you who are watching, this is Roberto's book. And it's so, It's so good.
Thank you.
But the becoming part is what I really latched onto. Well, body becoming, but the becoming part, I know my own doctoral research was on the living healing part, like what you're talking about as this journey. And there's something that feels the opposite of daunting when we look at it that way. You know, like I think I remember like in religion, we talked about sanctification, right? And it's this like grueling process of getting to this point, you know, heaven. And so there's this like end goal that you're trying to reach, but you also know you're never going to reach it here on this earth. And there's something really like freeing, which sounds counterintuitive, about saying, oh, no, we're like always becoming. We're always living this healing process. And I think that it's such a beautiful way to, gosh, like, look at this, what we're doing, what we're trying to do and bring into this world, this process of living in a totally different, liberated way.
Well, and you know, the book is not just about the individual body, but that we are situated in an ecosystem, that what I do impacts other people. And there is, you know, I write about how there is a dis-ease in our social body. And when we heal ourselves, it's like the butterfly effect. When we heal ourselves, we heal the world.
Yeah. And I wonder if you can talk to that or speak to that a little bit more, because you talk about that a lot, of this idea of the individual healing and how that impacts collective healing. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. This is not original ideas. Like, other people are talking about this. And I am just trying to do it from a theological and ethical perspective, that we can be a better body together, a better social body, when we begin to take care of ourselves. I mean, you know, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, which means we should love ourselves.
That's like brand new concept right there.
And we're not doing a good job loving ourselves. You know, we've accepted the fate of our religious upbringing, our inherited religious trauma, and we've not listened very well to that inner voice, right? Intuition or what have you. But we need to love ourselves. When we begin to love ourselves, and listen, it took me into my 40s to learn how to love myself. So this is not something that you just wake up when you're 10 or 12 and you're like, oh, I'm going to love myself and love myself well. And there, you know, I mean, maybe, but it took me well into my 40s to begin to love myself. And, you know, loving myself means taking a siesta every day. Loving myself means reading the things that are important to me. I'm a 5 on the Enneagram, so I love information. Loving myself means eating the things that are comfort to me, which mostly is rice and beans and Mexican food, because that's what I grew up on. But loving myself also means having the right relationships so that I can love myself.
Yeah.
And we just don't do that very well. So when we begin to love ourselves well, we can then begin to love others well, which also means our enemies.
Talk about that. That's the point where I like, your voice rose above the rest at Wild Goose Fest when you were talking about this. And I was like, oh, this is so good. Can you speak to that, please?
Well, I'm a bridge builder, and I believe that hate and violence has created a society that is a dog-eat-dog world.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that we can survive in that kind of environment. We're not built to. Look at our language. Our language is even violent. We crushed it. We killed it. And I'm like, okay, how do we be, and oftentimes we say that against like an opposing team or right. And when we get out of this oppositional logic, us against them, we can reframe enemy as our neighbor. And when we begin to be better neighbors as we exist on planet Earth, I think we can be a better social body, but we're not taught how to love our neighbors, and we're not taught how to build bridges with our enemies so that they can become our neighbors.
Mm-hmm. I love that. There's just one anecdote I have, and this will probably be a bad paraphrase, so correct me if I am totally off on it. But I recall, I believe it was the last conversation that you had with Adrian from Dirty Rotten Church Kids.
Uh-huh.
And this does tie into what we were talking about, I promise. And he was, I forgot exactly how he asked the question, but something basically about like, if you could summarize like doing the work, so to speak, like what would that look like right now? And I think I recall what you said was eating breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm going to try to make a point of actually eating breakfast. And it's so interesting because when you said that, I was listening to it. I think I was driving on like a 6-hour road trip across North Carolina, going to see my parents anyway. And just thinking about a lot of things, but in you saying that, because, I'm thinking, oh yeah, what is the work? I'm so curious how you're going to summarize it, how you're going to articulate this. And eating breakfast. And honestly, when you said that, like, speaking of embodiment stuff, like the first thing I noticed is that I had tears. Because it's like a weight was lifted. I don't have to conquer the world. Like, literally, this one small act of taking care of myself, like, that can be enough. That can be the work for today. Anyway, I just didn't want to forget that piece. That was very meaningful. And I definitely see how it ties into everything we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just to piggyback on that, something I go back to that I read 20 years ago that my teacher wrote, Dr. Nancy Elizabeth Bedford. She wrote that, our work is to discern a way forward and to make little moves against destructiveness. And eating breakfast is making small moves against destructiveness. Taking a siesta is making small moves against destructiveness. Our work is to be faithful in the small things. I never was trying to have a platform. I never was trying to be a public scholar or public theologian. That I didn't set out to do that. The people who know me very well know that I'm an intense introvert, that I struggle with always being out in public. I don't have much anonymity. In Nashville, I would go to places and people would walk up to me and say, "Are you Dr. Roberto Che Espinoza?" And it's very invasive. And here I am, I'm just trying to plant seeds for another possible world. I'm not trying to be anything other than just a faithful theologian, which takes a lifetime. And hopefully I have some wisdom to share with folks. But yeah, our job is to be faithful in the small things, to make little moves against destructiveness.
That's so beautiful, because that feels so manageable. And it also feels like the antithesis of things like, various systems of oppression and capitalism, right. So to eat breakfast, like, moves against this productivity mindset, and yet that allows us to be, I know when I eat breakfast, I am present. I am able to connect with myself and others in a way that feels meaningful. And so I think for you to, like what you're saying, to just bring it back to these really tiny things, it actually is very profound. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna write that down. Little moves against destructiveness.
Yeah.
It's just so succinct, but it embodies it perfectly. I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm curious to know then, I really resonate with your intense introversion. I resonate with Nashville being a very tiny town, even though it's exponentially growing, and the energy that it takes to navigate just a casual, Saturday morning at the farmer's market even.
Right.
So I'm curious to know then, what does coming from this place of body becoming, how does that shift your interactions with people? What does that look like?
Well, I mean, I always talk to people, and I am always very friendly, even though it cost me a lot to do that, right? Which is why I take a siesta every day.
I love that.
But I take advantage of the opportunity to be in conversation with people. What are they reading? What are they learning? What can I learn from them? How can I contribute? How can they contribute to my thinking? So I try to take advantage of the moment because you never know when, wisdom will emerge.
I love that. Yeah. I can very much resonate with that. Both the curiosity and like passion of that and the exhaustion of it as well. I was listening to a podcast the other day on the Enneagram actually. And one of the comments they made about fives was fives have a set amount of energy every day. You can't, store it up for the next day. It's just, and so I can imagine then that first of all, being embodied is going to be extremely difficult for a five because living from shoulders up is going to be the most natural space to live in. But then also to say, so not only am I doing this internal work that requires a daily amount of energy, I'm now gifting that to other people.
Right.
And yet doing it from this place of genuine desire for relationship and connection. That's pretty cool. I love that.
Thank you.
This may be unfair, an unfairly narrow question. I'm not, but I want to ask for folks who are coming out of high demand religion, who have fundamentalism, what would you say to them? I realize that might be a very hard thing to condense, but I'm curious what comes to mind today when I ask that question.
When I think about my own story, it was curiosity that got me out of high control religion. And there are a lot of people who have had imagination and curiosity policed out of them within high control religion. I was a theology student as an undergrad. And so I was introduced to the science of theology in academia, as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old. And so I was being pushed to confront my own conceptions of God and Jesus and the church, while also being in the rise of the megachurch. But I was curious. I remained curious. And what was also happening during that time is my own gender identity and queerness was emerging. And so I was like, okay, am I going to be curious about myself and curious about this thing that I've been socialized into? Or am I just going to follow the path and conform and assimilate? And I decided I was going to be curious and try to remain curious.
It seems like that's another area of the infinity symbol, right?
Yeah.
Like you're curious about yourself, which makes curiosity for others.
Right.
Yeah, that's like the theme of your life. It seems like that's so cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious to know, is there anything that you wish we would ask you?
I mean, these were great questions. And, I think that, gosh, if we could just continue to have these kinds of conversations, like how do we do this more often with more people? How do we nurture these conversations?
Yeah. I think what you've talked about today makes that possible and manageable. Like when you talk about planting the seeds, that feels close to home, right? So when you say, how do we nurture these conversations? I don't have to go rent out an event space and try to market to get people in to have this conversation. I can be on the back patio with my neighbor and I can have these conversations, and I'll, it can happen in my direct sphere of influence. And yet that's what then shapes change and shifts the social body, like you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. And, energy never dies. And so, this is where what I do in the world impacts somebody somewhere.
Right.
Because energetically it moves. If we know anything about quantum physics, the little bit of movement here impacts something else.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which is true in this situation.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so appreciative of everything that you've shared today.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you want to just let people know, where can they find you? What are your books? Where can they get them? All the things.
Yeah. So I've written 2 books. Activist Theology is my praxis book on how to live out theology, how to do theology. So that's called Activist Theology. And then my second book is Body Becoming: A Path to Our Liberation. They can be found wherever books are sold. They are published under my given name, but Broadleaf and Fortress are working on getting them republished in my new name.
Excellent.
Which will be great. Yeah. I just think that would be nice to have.
Yeah. And also, like, part of the becoming process, like how symbolic, right?
Right.
I love that.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
cool.
And then I'm online on Instagram as Dr. Roberto Che, and I'm on all the social media sites. I do write a Substack, and that Substack is ourcollectivebecoming.com. And I'm just, again, trying to plant seeds and create conditions for another possible world.
I love that. That's wonderful. Yeah. So everybody needs to go and buy the books, follow social media, do the Substack. Is your Substack linked to your website also?
Yes, it's on my website too. Yes.
Great. So we will have all of that in the show notes so that you can quickly click over. Andrew, anything else that you want to add?
Nothing as far as questions go. Just I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. I've not to sound totally creepy, but I've lurked in the shadows on Instagram, and I've known of you since the first episode you did with DRCK. Honestly, it might be years ago at this point. I don't know. And then of course, the more recent one with Adrian. I've always appreciated what you've been talking about, and I've definitely been listening. So definitely excited to finally be able to speak with you directly via Zoom. So
yeah. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, Andrew, that was such a great conversation. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
Oh, so many thoughts, but I always appreciate what they have to say. The one piece that sticks with me, the living life from the shoulders up.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's just a reality that so many of us, from fundamentalism, but truthfully, even outside of fundamentalism, just the culture in general, I think, as we know it, so much of it is disembodied and living just from the shoulders up. That really resonated. And then what was that other phrase? Small moves against destructiveness. So something to that effect. I might be paraphrasing a little bit.
Yeah.
But that too, like those are a couple of lines. Like that's just a new way of framing stuff that I sort of already knew, but just a different way of embodying it, I suppose. And anyway, it's just something I'll really be sitting with. I really appreciated that. And
something that I think is so manageable. I think that's what I was struck by, that question of, like you were reflecting from the DRCK podcast, and it's like, what's my next step is like to eat breakfast. Right. And it's like everything that Dr. Roberto talked about felt like I can do that. I think sometimes, when we talk about like doing the work, it becomes this elusive concept that feels so much bigger than us.
Yeah.
And I think this whole conversation really showed me that their work is about bringing it into like, I have the capacity to do this right here, right now in my sphere of influence in my own body and with the people that are around me. And to me, that feels particularly important in this process of healing, this ongoing process of healing. It's very different than what we are taught. I think about like, what is it? The Great Commission, go out into all the world or whatever. And Dr. Roberto is talking about like, but like, don't forget about the right here. Like that changes the world by doing our own internal work and bringing that into our relationships. And that infinity kind of movement, infinity sign movement really is resonating with me, sticking with me. Really, really loving that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just the emphasis. I think this is so important, but just the emphasis on just relationship and community, and that
Yes.
being that being so much, like that kind of being the
Yes.
crux of so much of it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Relationships as an agent of change.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
so love that.
And
So love that.
and just that being juxtaposed with when I was in evangelicalism, you know, relationships, if it was somebody who was not already within the church, it was a salvation project. It was an obligation. It was coercive. It just flies in the face of that. But it's like such a breath of fresh air, though, you know, to realize like really all I need to be doing is just, you know, curiosity, being curious. You don't have to change people. Anyway,
no. Which kind of leads to the other thing I was really struck by, and this is something that when I was at Wild Goose Fest, my booth, the CTRR booth, was kind of like in the middle of like 5 other tents where they had speakers every hour. They shifted, you know, speaker and topic and everything like that. And Dr. Roberto happened to be in one of the tents that I was catty corner from. So it was kind of like wherever I directed my attention, then I could really hear what each speaker was saying. Otherwise, it was just kind of mass chaos of voices. And I heard Dr. Roberto talking about this idea of loving your enemies and what that looks like to be an embodied person, and then how that shifts the way that we love our enemies. And our enemies don't stay our enemies. They become these real humans in front of us. And they gave these examples of that means this group of people or that group of people, or, you know, people that I think sometimes we bristle and we go, oh, yeah, but not them. Right. And this idea of like, when I say I want, you know, justice or liberation or freedom or healing or embodiment for all, that includes the people that I bristle against, and maybe even people who have traditionally been pretty harmful. And so I just really appreciated the challenge of that concept, because I don't know that it's easy to live out, and I'm certainly not doing that perfectly. But I really appreciate the challenge there, because I think like they were talking about, like this, as I internally shift, it shifts my relationships and my interactions with others. And I want to be a person known for being able to be kind and loving and compassionate to somebody, even if they don't believe the same way that I do. So it's like a lifelong challenge.
Yeah. Well, it's like, it's just like an extension of like that curiosity piece of like, I want to be grounded and guided by my curiosity. Like maybe there is somebody that I do bristle at them, and then but now I'm curious, okay, what's going on here?
Right.
You know, and exploring that, as opposed to just reacting out of fear and being reactive to it. You know, I think curiosity is a great foundational piece for so much of all the things that we talk about.
Yeah. Oh, such a good conversation. I feel like I'm going to be ruminating in a good way about this for a while.
Good rumination. Yes.
Yeah, I love it.
I agree.
Okay, it is time to do some listener Q&As. For those of you who don't know, we love to have your questions and thoughts about the podcast. You can go to our website, www.sundaysschooldropoutspod.com, and submit your questions, and we will try to answer them on the air. Don't worry, we'll not out who you are. We'll remove all identifying information, but we want to give you a chance to ask your questions, and we will take a stab at answering them. So, one of our listener questions from this week is, how can I process the anger that I have at my parents for subjecting me to high control religion? So just very light and easy. Andrew, do you want to take a stab at this?
It's just such a good question. And it's one that processing anger, like relating to fundamentalism, is like, I hear it come up a lot. I mean, my first thing that I would say is that it's okay to be angry. I just want to absolutely validate that anger so much. Like, my goal is not to, even professionally, like if you were my client, my goal is not to, let's get you through that anger so we can move beyond it and you're not feeling it anymore. Actually, no, like I want to be curious about that anger. I want to befriend that anger. Yeah. And when you do that, the anger will shift. It might lessen in intensity. It might become more open. It might tell you other things that it actually is caring about. It may not be what you think it is, but I would be so curious about it. And so back to the point, my goal is to be curious about that anger. It's okay to be angry. You're not bitter. You're not, or any of those things that have negative connotations. Like, it is a completely valid response to the things that you experienced.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's worth noting, like, anger actually shows us the things that matter to us, that have value to us. And so to feel anger over something shows us the things that we are the most passionate about, that matter the most, including ourselves in our own experience. So, I think processing anger is necessary, but the actual anger, it just shows us what's important to us. And I think that's really important, especially for so many of us coming out of high control religions where anger was not something that was allowed to be felt and certainly not expressed, right? Unless there was like a righteous anger for God, something that was happening against the faith or something like that. But even then, you had to be very careful that anger did not turn into a sin, which of course they didn't put a lot of parameters around, but that's a whole other conversation. Right. But yeah, I think I very much agree with you. Giving yourself that permission first to just recognize anger is normal and natural when the things the most important to us have been violated, when there's something that's bumped up against them. Yeah,
definitely. And I'll often use the phrase, or like, the wisdom of anger, like with folks I work with, like, because what you just said, like, the thing with that part of you that's showing up that way, like, it very clearly, no filters, no bullshit, is recognizing something that happened that was not okay, that you are grieving, that you're upset about, something that was not just, something that happened. And it's, there is so much wisdom there, honestly. And so, again, that is why I am so curious about anger and why I am so interested in it.
Yeah. So if if this person is in our office and we're talking through, like, okay, I do have this anger, and I can even validate the fact that it's okay. It's okay to feel anger, and it's okay to express anger, and it shows me what's important to me. How do we navigate that in particular towards our parents, whether that's just feeling it or expressing it, for the way that we grew up, right? The way that they trained us, the way that they raised us. How would you start to navigate that with someone?
Yeah, like, meaning like how they would relate or interact with parents, like literally.
Yeah, I mean, it could. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the question is, like, how could I process the anger that I have? And so to me, when I read that, there's like two parts of it. There's like the internal processing piece of it, and then how do I actually then, like, translate that into action or lived experience in relationship or not with parents?
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things I could say. One thing I will say, speaking to the internal work, like, I do think there's work that can be done with processing that anger, the work of validating the anger, being curious of and exploring that anger, then also the parts of you that were harmed, that the anger is acknowledging and responding to and defending, like, nurturing those parts, kind of retrieving those parts of yourself and helping them to kind of be nurtured again in a way that they weren't. Because again, that's, especially in the context with parents and high demand religion, that dynamic is probably where a lot of that anger is showing up. And so kind of being able to, like, the parts work term would be like reparent, that idea, kind of being able to reparent some of those parts of yourself that were let down. Now, in terms of the external, like literal family relationships and dynamics, that is my favorite phrase. It depends. Because
very true.
I have to acknowledge there are some family dynamics that you can do everything right, and it may just not be a safe place to have these conversations in, like, the literal interpersonal sense. And it really just depends on so much, and if that's what it is, and it's not safe to have those conversations, like, that's okay. Don't feel like you have to. Like, the goal with, like, boundaries and assertive communication and all this work is not to get you geared up to step into a place that's just not safe, you know, like that's not what I want folks to do. But anyway, I feel like I'm rambling a little bit now, but it does depend a lot when it comes to the actual family relationship, though.
I agree with that. And I think, there's a lot of times where I've worked with clients where they're kind of like afraid to touch some of these more intense emotions, like anger, because the fear is if I process my anger, if I start feeling it, two things are going to happen. A, it is going to ruin everything. Maybe that's my current relationship or a shot at the relationship or, anything like that. But B, it's going to require that I go and then have conversations and, be really vocal and open about whatever it is that I'm changing and trying to create a relationship in this way. And so I think it's always important to give yourself kind of that space to consider, like, let's not put an end goal on this. Like the goal for processing anger is not so that we can have a relationship or so that we can forgive or so that we can set boundaries. Like, let's take an end goal off of it. And let's just say, as we process this, like, the end will be determined as it's determined, which, like, we don't have an end goal for it. And I think that can sometimes be really helpful, because then it's like, all right, so if I do then use the courage to start processing anger, because that's a very courageous act, like, then I don't have to hold myself back because I don't really want to have that conversation down the road. If we take the end goals off, it just gives us freedom to be present. The other piece of it that comes to mind is, going back to some of our episodes on, like, what is trauma and what is the nervous system. Our nervous system is what is holding these intense experiences, the things that then come back up for us as triggers or whatnot. And so we need to have ways to release them. But the cool part about the way our body and brain and nervous system all work together is that we don't actually have to, like, recreate a situation or a specific conversation or anything. Our body just needs a way to get that anger, in this case, out. It doesn't have to be actually at your parent or at your pastor or at, whomever. Sometimes that's not going to be the best way to process anger, is to go and, like, have a conversation with somebody. That may not be the safest thing. Or it may be impossible, right? Because we may be angry with people that are no longer in our lives, whether that's because it's, way in the past or they've passed on or, whatever it is. But our bodies don't necessarily need to go back and have that conversation or tell that person we're angry with them. Our bodies just need the ability, the space to get that out. And so, a lot of times my clients will say, like, I just want to, like, scream at them or rip their head off or punch them or whatever. And to me, that tells me what your body is needing, where that energy is stored that's needing to be released. And so, no, we're not going to actually go hit them, right? But we can give our bodies experiences of going through that motion. And maybe that means my fist meets a pillow, or maybe just the air, right? Where I'm getting that energy out of my body. Or maybe I do give myself a space to scream. Maybe that is into a pillow to muffle the sound. Maybe it's a scream. So, like, the energy of a scream at the volume of a whisper. I call that squispering. And so our body just needs spaces to get that energy out. Yeah. And once that's been resolved, then it kind of clears up some space to go, okay, now what next? What do I need next? Maybe that is a conversation. Maybe it's boundaries. Maybe it's space. Maybe it's, a variety of things.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of it, though, is because you get to decide what that is.
Yes.
Just absolutely. Like you get to decide, like, if there's good, because I've had that same, those reservations come up with folks I work with, of like, I want to process this, but I really am terrified of this inevitability of I'm going to have a hard conversation with mom and dad. And then, I've said, not if you don't want to.
Yeah.
And if there is parts of you that are like, I don't want to do that, then don't do it. Like, honor that. That's okay. Like, we can stay here with the parts that are needing that help and support as long as they need it. There's not a timer on this,
Yeah. And I know the question didn't ask this, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts too. Like, I think that there's a lot of internal dissonance of this idea of, like, our parents, who are supposed to be the ones that are bigger, stronger, wiser, safer, like keeping us safe, are also then subjecting us to this harmful doctrine and theology and practices, but calling it safe and love.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious to know your thoughts on, I don't know, I don't even know what I'm asking, like the internal dissonance that happens, or maybe even just to normalize that a little bit, or what do you think?
Well, I mean, just from a caretaker perspective, I mean, the one person and entity that's supposed to nurture you and keep you safe, when you can't do that for yourself, and then if they don't, I mean, that is like the ultimate betrayal. And so I think it's a profoundly deep level of grief and all that entails, to process through that. I don't think it can be overstated enough how powerful that is. So, and now I apologize. I'm trying to remember what the original question was, but
the original question was just, how do I process the anger that I have at my parents? And that's why I think part of, I'm guessing, but I know just from working with clients, like part of that anger truly is like, these were the people that were supposed to keep me safe and to love me and nurture. And yet they're also the people that caused this harm or subjected me to it, put me in environments where that would be happening to me.
Well, like I said, it's a betrayal, and I understand parents might have had the best of intentions. Let's even presume they did. Okay. Sure. They had good intentions, but impact was harmful, And so, and that's valid. The pain is valid. The grief of that betrayal is valid. And, I think that's really, it gets the validation piece, I guess, in summary, is what I really focus on. It is a lot. It is heavy. And the way that shows up in your body, because when, we've talked about it, we've been talking about embodiment recently some, and one thing that comes up, what you described, being told, like being harmed, and your body feels that, your body knows that. And yet then being told, like, this is actually good for you, or I do this because I love you, or this is God's will for your life, and this is what it means to be like sanctified, or whatever.
Right.
All of those narratives. It does really start to create this disembodied state where, okay, well, I can't, this feels gross, but I'm wrong. I can't trust that because I'm being told this other thing, and this is what I'm supposed to believe. And my parents are the ones telling me this, or my pastor who I trust is the one telling me this. Or it's the whole culture that I've grown up in is telling me this. You very much do learn to suppress the voice of your body in the interest of staying safe. And so, I think, it does very much create this state of disembodiment for the sake of survival.
Yeah. So then piggybacking off of what Dr. Roberto said is like the curiosity piece, then that's maybe where we start. That curiosity, that non-judgmentalism, which goes, I think, hand in hand with curiosity, is saying like, what is happening internally? What is this anger part of me? Can I be curious about it? Can I not judge it? Can I just let it be there and share with me what is happening? Like giving me that information so that I can kind of almost intuitively go, okay, well, what is next? And I know, what I need to do next. But I really think that interest, when I was going through the questions for today, I didn't think, oh, this question would fit with like what we're talking about with Dr. Roberto. However, it does, because the more embodied we become, the more connected to our emotions we are, which then gives us access to express them, which then, like deepens our embodiment. So there we are, back to that infinity signal again.
Yes, seriously.
Yeah. Well, I want to just acknowledge, like, these are really big, deep questions. They're great. Keep them coming. We may not be able to answer them fully in the depth and specificity that each person needs, but I love that we're having these conversations. And I love that people are asking these questions, because it also shows just like the passion and vigor that people are seeking healing and wholeness.
Yep. Yeah. Love it.
So with that, I think we're good for today. Anything else that you have?
Nothing that comes to mind. It's been really, really good conversations, and I'll definitely be thinking on them for the weeks to come, the days and weeks to come. It's been really good.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too. All right. Well, on that note, then I guess we can sign off and everybody can, be blessed.
Be blessed.